Secretary of Defense the other day made a statement. He wasn't even sure how many people he had out there in terms of different contractors. So it seems to me to be a fair question, is it not? That if you don't know how many people are out there and you have this big drug problem, to maybe do some kind of cursory review of what's going on with your contractors who may or may not be coming into contact with some of these drug supply routes.
Yes, sir. I can speak to the ones that I know about in my programs, and I can say that I haven't seen that. The general question about contractors I know is one that has the attention at the very highest levels of the Department of Defense, and an awful lot of work is being done because of the some of the wider concerns that you allude to today.
You know, if this whole hearing is about what are we doing to reduce the amount of drugs that are coming into this country and the effectiveness of the programs, they're up. Since we have a proliferation of contractors, it seems to me that there's also potential routes into the country that open up through these different contractors. Just thought I'd share with you that observation.
Yeah, it's a very good point, and the general concern about the contractors, and more to the point, their subcontractors and their subcontractors, is one that has very much the attention of the department. Absolutely.
And you're familiar with the Tierney report about how we contract out, and the contractors have subcontractors who actually end up shooting at our own troops.
Yes, sir.
I mean, there's, so the drug issue comes up in that. Mr. Jordan, thank you for your indulgence. Go on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I think just underscoring the need for the right kind of processes and structures to be in place so we can measure all this. Thank you all for being with us. Mr. Kurtokowski, thank you. I know you've been in front of our committee and Judiciary Committee several times, so we appreciate the work you do and your willingness to come here. The National Drug Control Strategy issued on in May of this year states that the administration firmly opposes the legalization of drugs, which is obviously a good statement to see, and that would include, Mr. Kurtokowski, legalization of marijuana.
You're correct, Mr. Jordan.
In light of that, talk to me about what at least appears to be somewhat contradictory, the Justice Department's decision relative to the law in California with respect to marijuana and the National Drug Control Strategy issued just 2 months ago, and likely what may happen in the district relative to the substance of marijuana.
The two issues are the legalization of drugs, including legalization of marijuana, and then the second part is the medical marijuana issue. Medical marijuana has been in California since 1996. I don't think there's anyone that doesn't recognize the explosion in the last several years of medical marijuana dispensaries and recommendations that have come out. The Attorney General, and I believe rightly so, through his office issued guidelines to the 15 U.S. attorneys or 16 U.S. attorneys that operate within districts that have medical marijuana, essentially talking about the finite resources that they had, and that if a medical marijuana dispensary was operating clearly within the laws of that particular state, that the U.S. attorney should consider the use of finite resources, whether or not that would be appropriate. It didn't prohibit them from doing it. The media had an absolute field day with that, and I believe that it was incredibly incorrectly interpreted, because if you read those guidelines, he said that anything that involves violence, anything that involves for-profit, anything that involves underage sales, and on, that all of the resources or resources of those U.S. attorneys and federal law enforcement resources were appropriate. And we do know that cases have been made by the United States Attorney, and I am aware of active investigations that are going on. So that's the medical marijuana. Drug legalization, marijuana legalization, the administration has firmly repeated that it's either a non-starter.
Let me ask you personally, as head of ONDCP, as the face of our efforts to curtail and hopefully stop the use of drugs in our country, do you think it's appropriate when states or the District of Columbia, well, no, let's just say it this way, do you agree with the whole medical marijuana approach frankly, as happening in California right now?
I would tell you that I think that it's very clear that a number of the recommendations, doctors can't issue a prescription. The number of recommendations that are issued by physicians, and it is only a very small percentage of the physicians, are highly questionable. That being said, the medical marijuana question should be decided through the same process that science uses to decide and the United States government uses to decide other
But I'm asking you
other
personally,
medicines.
with your extensive experience in law enforcement, the good work I think you're doing as the head of this agency, do you personally think these type of laws are beneficial to our country or harmful to our country?
I think there's some benefits in further exploration of what could be helpful to patients as a result of marijuana. I clearly think that this mass amount of media attention that has been given to medical marijuana sends the wrong message and is inappropriate for young people in this country.
That's good to hear. Do you think when states have this medical marijuana statute in place that it makes it easier it's the first step towards legalization? Would you agree with that?
I would tell you that I think that I've heard a number of statements from people that are in the pro-legalization business that medical marijuana issues were a gateway. I still think that there are also, though, some benefits that need to be further explored and further refined for people that could use marijuana in a medicinal way.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I got another line of questioning, but I'll wait till the next round. You're going to do another round? Okay.
We are, yes. Okay. Mr. Wexler, Congress has provided, first of all, I want to say that we have been joined by Mr. Tierney, whose report I cited just before he came into the committee room. We appreciate your presence here. Thank you, sir. Congress has provided over $6 billion to the Department of Defense Counternarcotics program since 2005. GAO reports that since 2006, cocaine removal rates from interdiction have declined and have not reached any of the annual targets to date. The 2010 ONDCP strategy calls for the removal of 40% of the cocaine moving through the transit zone annually by 2015. Mr. Wexler, is this goal realistic? How much money will we have to spend to get to that percentage, and what outcomes do you expect as a result of these efforts?
Yes, sir. The goal is realistic if we have the resources, and additional resources will be required to meet that higher goal. I think it's important to set goals that are not easily achievable, but that actually push the agencies to do the best that they can. We are going through a process right now to figure out exactly what combination of additional assets and additional programs might be required to hit that goal. And that's where we are in that process.
Is it cost effective? I mean, are you looking at the cost effectiveness of this?
The answer is yes. And
it is cost effective now?
No, the answer is yes, that we are looking at that problem. Before you get to cost effectiveness, you have to get to effectiveness in the first point. And when we looked at the 285 different metrics that had been left to us by the last administration, we've been reviewing them for a whole variety of characteristics. And what we found is that some of them are applicable and some of them are not applicable for basic level effectiveness. When you get to cost effectiveness, then you have to look at that in the context of the budget process, which we run every year. To be quite honest, we are not there yet, but we have a very, very thorough process to get us there in a way that won't just simply answer your question quickly but easily, and then you'll be asking the same question, 2 years from now when someone else is sitting in the seat.
You understand the importance of this, though, because Congress now we're looking very seriously at these questions of you just don't throw money at a problem.
The challenges that you face with the budget are very, very well understood. I believe that one of my primary goals is the steward of U.S. taxpayer dollars on your behalf, and I want to make sure that the programs that we run are not only effective but are also cost effective. A great amount of things that we do are effective. I will need to find out, and some of them that I've seen I can conclude are cost effective, but I am still doing additional work.
We'll go deeper into this. I want to go to Ambassador Johnson just for a minute here. You cited recent declines in production of cocaine in Colombia, but isn't it true that despite fluctuations, coca production has been remarkably steady since before Plan Colombia even began. So after spending over $4 billion on these efforts, illicit crop reduction is at best slightly lower than it was before we started pouring money into the country's counter-narcotics efforts. It doesn't seem to me to be a good use of taxpayers' dollars. And isn't it true that the production has increased in Peru and Bolivia to offset any gains made in Colombia? So why is eradication still being funded at such high levels? Ambassador.
The statement that you made about changes in Peru and in Colombia, excuse me, and in Bolivia are regrettably true. There have been some sustained.
I like the way you put that. I mean, that was very artfully done. I just want to state that that was artfully done.
Thank you, sir.
Please continue.
There have been some sustained gains in Peru based on programs that work very clearly and very much in a teamwork effort between the eradication efforts that we provide support for, as well as the alternative development and governance building efforts that AID, through the appropriations that it's provided, works with. I think the change in Colombia is reflected over the time that you cite. There was a continued growth in area under cultivation and in cocaine production for a substantial time after Plan Colombia was begun, and that corner was not turned for several years afterwards. But as your previous witness has stated, there's a substantial decline measured over the course of the last several years in the amount of cocaine that's available from that production and the amount that's actually grown in Colombia. Bolivia is a much more challenging situation. We have a program there where we have worked with the government there to address an eradication of a gross amount, but due to changes on the ground there, including the attitude of the government toward coca production, the area under cultivation, in fact, grows in the neighborhood of 10 to 12% per annum over the course of the last several years.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Jordan.
Chairman, Mr. Kurtikowski, when Mr. Ford was in front of the committee a few minutes ago, I talked to him about whether the GAO had done any assessment of how effective your treatment programs the federal government's involved with. Can you elaborate on and maybe tell us what the GAO has not looked at, your assessments of how you're doing on the treatment side?
I think that I share your concerns and certainly the chair's concerns over the lack of the timely, relevant data. When I was police chief and made decisions for 2,000 people with several $100 million budget, I actually had a lot more data and a lot more timely data to do that than I've seen here. That's why the National Drug Control Strategy has devoted an entire chapter to improving the quality of the data. There are two things that make the assessment of the treatment programs difficult. One, there is a whole plethora of treatment programs that are out there, and many of the treatment programs report their results in very different ways, as far as recidivism within a month, recidivism within a year, and the fact that actually in treatment, part of treatment is in fact that people relapse. The other problem is that state and local communities often do, either through in-kind services or their own local tax dollars, an awful lot of treatment that we don't have control over. It's interesting that in Mexico right now they're working very hard to consolidate how treatment is done and how it's measured, because they're seeing a growing addiction population in that country. We could benefit here in the United States from doing the same.
In the folks you contract with, or the folks who provide the treatment, what percentage are faith-based groups or entities who are doing that work?
An awful lot of the treatment is paid for, as you know, from the HHS block grant that flows to the states. I do not know the percentage of faith-based, but I would tell you that the most recent meta-analysis, for instance, on prevention, talks about that if there are trusted messengers giving young people information, and I'm talking in the prevention area here, that would include faith-based, that can have a positive effect on young people.
But you don't have any measure to say if a faith-based faith-based approaches are working better or worse or more successful, less successful than non-faith-based approach?
I don't know.
Okay, that would
but-
certainly be something I would like to follow. Let me just ask you along those lines. There's the well, I'll say the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration Modernization Act. I'd like to get your thoughts on a provision contained within that act. This is sponsored by Representative Green, Representative Kennedy. And let me just read a quick paragraph, if I could, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is to Mr. Kurlikowski. With respect to any activity to be funded in whole or part through an award, a grant, a cooperative agreement, or contract under this title, or any other statutory authority of the administration, the administrative director of the center involved, may not make such an award unless the applicant agrees to refrain from considering religion or any profession of faith when making an employment decision regarding an individual who is or will be assigned to carry out the portion of the activity. Do you think we need to place that kind of limitation on some of these faith-based groups who are doing the work of helping treat people with drug problems, this kind of limitation on a faith-based organization? It seems to me what's going to happen is if you place this kind of limitation on those, they'll say, we just can't do the work any longer. We just can't apply because it violates their statement of faith.
I would not want to see that in particular, but what I would like to support is certainly on the hiring decisions that you're not going to discriminate against people coming into those programs based upon the religion. But I think that the faith-based programs can have beneficial effect, and I'd be happy to follow up with you and with SAMHSA.
Well, I'd like to be a little clearer because it seems to me what you just said is contradictory, because you said you want the faith-based groups to continue to do the work, but if they can't hire the people who support their statement of faith, how are they going to be able to continue to do the work? So that's my point. And
Well,
it seems to me this act is going to undermine the ability of the faith-based organizations, which you have said are doing some of this treatment and doing a good job at it. If we make this change, we're going to keep them from being able to do this kind of work.
And I'm not sure I agree, Mr. Jordan, because I think if the bar is not to discriminate against somebody coming in, but yet not to prohibit the practice and the way that that organization does the treatment, I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive.
I think what we got to focus on is what's going to help the individual with the drug problem. That's what this whole thing is about today. That's what this hearing is about. That should be our focus. And if these groups are working, I don't think we need to be making this change. But we'll follow up with that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Tierney.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Mr. Kurlikowski and others. Thank you. Look, this is all about the money, right? I mean, that's what people are in this business for? Or does anybody have another suggestion what this is? It's all about the money. We can treat people all day long, but as long as there's money involved, they're going to keep pushing this thing around and find other people to get to deal with. We can interdict it, and they're going to just find a different route to take it to market. We can sort of try to eradicate, they're just going to find another place to grow it. So how do we go about getting the money? Making it, the first thing, corruption, obviously. If we're talking about a place like Afghanistan, you go after the corruption. You arrest the guys, including a stepbrother to Karzai, or whoever it might be in the chain there, and show that you're serious about it, and you take them out of the loop and maybe get some progress there. And I assume that we can talk about that in any country where it's there, but even that's going to be difficult unless you go to get the money. So how do we do that? What are our efforts so far in that regard? How successful have they been or not been? What aren't we doing that we should be doing? Because until we take the money out of this, I think we're behind the eight ball. So if I could just go left to right on that.
I think that the money is absolutely critical, and I have been extremely impressed with the work that I've seen lately from FinCEN, from the Department of Treasury, from the Department of Homeland Security. Also some of the state and local efforts. The recent settlement that Attorney General Goddard had with Western Union includes additional law enforcement training in how to detect the money issue for local law enforcement. Quite often we think that it's going to be a federal law enforcement agency that is going to go after the money. What we really need to do is to bring a whole nother group of resources into that fight, and that is the deputy sheriffs and the state and local law enforcement who may not have either the tools or the training to go after the money. We are actually seeing these kinds of training initiatives increase. Along with that, the Department of Homeland Security license plate reader system that can perhaps detect the suspect vehicles that may be going south with the bulk cash, a number of both backscatter X-ray systems and also X-ray vans that the customs on the south side of the border, the Mexican customs, can use. As you know, it was not that common in the past for cars, once they had entered Mexico, to be searched by the government of Mexico customs. That is changing pretty dramatically also. I think also making the going after the money sexy is particularly important. We often spread out the drugs and see the perpetrators when it comes to seizures and weapons. We don't often spread out the money on the table and then make sure that people see what's going on. And I'm sure Mr. Wexler and Ambassador Johnson can tell you about some great work that has been done at interdicting bulk cash outside our borders.
Ambassador?
Congressman, I think virtually every program that we have has some element in it that is dedicated exclusively to chasing cash for its own sake. But I think they also have to be looked at as a combined effort. There aren't any, there's not a single solution to this. And with
Let me interrupt you if I can, Ambassador, because just a moment ago, Mr. Kulikowski told me that we're under-resourced in those avenues of changing, of looking at the cash and looking for the money. So I guess with the real paucity of success that we have on interdiction, for instance, where all it does is move it from one place to another, why aren't we considering moving some of the resources from there to a place where we know it'll have more effect?
What I was saying was that we do have resources dedicated to this, but the resources to chasing the money sometimes don't appear directly there. We have resources that are dedicated to these devices and the training for the Mexicans so that they can detect the bulk cash. We have resources that are dedicated to training individuals in places all over the world, to inspecting and knowing how to detect individuals who may be leaving through airports with substantial amounts of cash with them. But there's also an element of, for example, the program in Colombia that has to do with reforming the judicial system that allows them to detect people and prosecute them who have been smuggling cash and engaging in money laundering. So these elements, when taken together, I think form a whole. The exact proportion that might be spent more on non-intrusive inspection devices, for example, as opposed to ships at sea, I think that's worthy of some consideration. But it's a multivariable calculation you're trying to make here.
I guess it is, except that we've had years and years and years of experience of not doing very well with interdiction and with eradication. All right, we've shown that we're just bouncing the ball back and forth, whacking it off the wall. Seems to me that the one area we know these guys are interested in and they have to have is cash and money, and they have to launder it, and we're talking banks and everything else. Why don't we just focus there like a laser beam and make this unprofitable for them, and the other stuff will take care of itself if you do that. Mr. Wexler?
Yes, sir. Of course, where the Department of Defense works is primarily focuses on this issue in the war zone. And you are exactly right. We have done a tremendous amount of work in the last year on this subject at a strategic level, at an operational level, and at a tactical level. And what we're doing today is tremendously different from where we were 18 months ago. We built out the Afghan Threat Finance Cell in Kabul. We're building out tactical level elements in Kandahar to work at this exact issue and the nexus of the money and the drugs and the insurgency in a coordinated interagency approach, so we can bring the military authorities where they are appropriate, but also bring together the law enforcement authorities and the Treasury Department's authorities where those are the appropriate tools to take for against a given target. We have a long way to go on this area, but we have had some significant successes recently, and the level of progress is one that I am very proud of.
I get a little, if I might, Mr. Chairman, just want to say, I get a little concerned when I see stories in the Wall Street Journal about $3 billion being put in cash on a plane and taken out of there. Now, I know some of that is the warlord stuff that we investigated, and that's lining pockets and going out, but I'm concerned that a lot of it is drug cash getting out of there. So we've got a long, long way to go on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
I want to say again that what what Chairman Tierney did with his report was extremely important. I hope that all of you will have a chance, and if you haven't already, to study it thoroughly, because when we consider how those people we're trying to work with are actually using U.S. resources to further their own avarice and to try to convert our resources into their own, and the potential of moving drug money out of the country. And we brought up before you came, Mr. Tierney, I brought up the issue of banks. We're going to get the Treasury engaged in that. And maybe we could do that jointly. And I think that the points that he's making are absolutely critical. The underlying dynamics that's driving so much of this is the tremendous amounts of money that people are making. Billions of dollars. And it becomes even more perplexing when you understand that we have brave men and women whose lives are on the line in some of these countries, who are totally dedicated to this country. And somebody's making, some groups are making billions of dollars off of their presence there. It's just there's something fundamentally wrong, so you gentlemen are each charged with grave responsibility to try to bring some alignment in these policies. I'm just going to go to my a final round of questions, and we'll try to move through this as quickly as possible, and I want to thank you for your indulgence and your time. I want to ask all the witnesses if you think labeling international state-building programs like alternative livelihood programs, rule of law initiatives, and justice reform as counter-narcotics policies, if it makes sense. Mr. Kurlikowski, let's go right down the line.
Right now, we're in the process of reviewing the budgeting accounting system that we are using for drugs. I think, as you know from the NAPA report, there was concern about how things were being accounted. We want to review this, and we are doing it. It will be done in the most transparent way possible.
Can you answer the question, though? I mean, what about labeling these international state-building programs?
I think there should be some portion of them that clearly do work for counter-narcotics, and I would think that there's some in the domestic area that also could be in a counter-narcotics mode also.
I want to go down the line, and then I've got a follow-up question to ask each of you. Go ahead.
I agree with the director. There's some portion of them should be. I think to label them 100% would be misleading. Cost accounting is hard, I know, but I think that in some cases, alternative livelihood is an essential part of a program. For example, in Peru and in Afghanistan, in some areas, those programs.
I want to stop you for a second because you just said something about it, potential for being misleading. Because what I was wondering is whether or not there is a risk that labeling these programs as counter-narcotics results in misguided policies because they're being judged based on how drug supply is diminished instead of improvements in good governments or socioeconomic development.
I think that a durable, effective, long-term program will have to have some element, perhaps a significant element, particularly on the rule of law side. We've had, from my point of view, a successful eradication program in Colombia, but that program will be durable over time to the extent that the Colombian authorities, with our support, are able to extend the reach of the state and provide state services, particularly security services and rule of law in areas that are ungoverned or poorly governed.
Wexler.
I'll defer to my colleagues who run the programs for the accounting, but what I can say is what we have recognized is that we cannot succeed in our counter-narcotics objectives based purely on a military approach to this, and we need the alternative development efforts to be part of this integrated plan for our counter-narcotics lines of operations to succeed as part of our wider counterinsurgency programs.
So then what's the significance, Ambassador Johnson, of labeling these state-building programs as counter-narcotics as opposed to just focusing on rule of law initiatives, justice reform? Why are they put into that ambit of counter-narcotics?
Well, part of them have a positive counter-narcotics effect. I'm not sure what you're meaning by put in the label of counter-narcotics. The appropriation that we receive is international narcotics and law enforcement. And there are programs which go beyond counter-narcotics for which I'm responsible.
You make a good point, which is something that this subcommittee should take note of, and that is that if our legislative and appropriation process guides those definitions, that also can drive a combining of programs or an overlap of programs. I thank you for making that point. That's a good point. Director Kurlikowski, ONDCP cites the U.S. role in taking out some of the major drug cartel leaders in Mexico as a sign of the effectiveness of U.S.'s participation in Mexico's war on drugs. Would you comment on the collateral consequences of taking out these cartel leaders, such as the destabilizing of the industry and creating a power vacuum, and does that cause more violence?
I think that it does cause more violence when the heads of some of these organizations are taken out. The anecdotal information is that the people that replace them, and there are always people that will replace them, are not as sophisticated, probably a bad term there, but not as sophisticated as perhaps the more entrenched leadership, and that they, in fact, may be more reckless. I think that experience is true in what we've seen in whether it was in Northern Ireland or here with our own organized crime.
Well, let me just ask one final question. How endangered is the government of Mexico itself from these cartels? I mean, do these cartels have the power to capsize the government of Mexico?
I do not think so.
Ambassador Johnson?
No.
Wexler?
No.
Okay. Mr. Jordan, a final round of
Thank you,
questions.
Mr. Chairman. Just one question. This will be for Ambassador Johnson, if we could. In your testimony, you talk about the experience in Bolivia where they expelled last year all DEA personnel, and yet in the final sentence in that same paragraph, you say, we will provide $20 million in logistics and training to support to Bolivia this year. You know, they kicked all our guys out, and yet we're still giving them money. It's sort of the old line. Why pay people who don't like you? They'd probably not like us for free. I mean, why are we doing that when obviously they said take a hike, and yet we're still sending taxpayer dollars, you know, to the tune of $20 million?
2 points. We're not giving the government of Bolivia any money.
Okay.
We're providing a service in cooperation with them to eradicate a substantial amount of standing coca, which is a program that we've operated there over several decades. I think that you raise a legitimate question as to whether this program, in the face of the absence of political will on the part of the Bolivian authorities clearly to combat these narcotics, is viable in the long term. I think that it is having the intended effect of eliminating a substantial portion of the crop.
But tell me how the money is being spent if we picked out our personnel and yet we're still spending $20 million there. So who do we have there? Tell me how it's working.
We have a team of people who work with the Bolivians, provide them with support for aviation, logistical support for moving around their country for the destruction of standing crop, as well as interdiction operations. What's missing with the departure of the DEA is an ability to really point those interdiction operations based on solid intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, we got folks there so the folks who are there on the ground are the ones handing out the money.
Excuse me, nobody's handing out any money.
But spending the money, helping them, and the people who could enforce the tough part of the tough love part of it, they're doing, no, we don't want those around. We just want the help part. We don't want the people around who actually see if we're doing things in the right way.
I don't know, there are a variety of motivations, but I think what's clear is that the program is working effectively as described, but it does not have the ability to work with a solid intelligence-led interdiction effort in the absence of the DEA.
I would agree with that. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Tierney.
Thank you. Mr. Kurlikowski, I first want to thank you for your written responses following the hearing that we had back in March. And we sent some written questions to you, and I want to appreciate the time and effort that you put into answering them. But some of what we explored in those was whether or not there was adequate data to make some of the determinations as to how to distinguish between what attempts are more successful than others in dealing with this issue. And part of your response indicated some $42 million or $42.6 million in the President's budget to help collect the data. I'm wondering if that's money well spent, given all the other studies that you cite from RAND and others that had very serious limitations in their usefulness.
I think it's unbelievably well spent when we talk about the multi-millions in the federal drug budget. I'm extremely disappointed to be having to cite 2006 or even 2007 data about who has died as a result of drugs, and then I tell you that this is the most recent data set available. Unfortunately, that is the case. So working with CDC, working with HHS to find out who's coming into jail and what drug are they under the influence of, who's being admitted to an emergency department in a hospital, and what kind of drug are they under the influence of. Coroner's reports, all of those kinds of things are particularly helpful. I mean, I truly believe that as we continue to focus an awful lot on marijuana and youth use, and appropriately so over a number of years, we had this kind of skyrocketing number of people dying from prescription drugs that was just kind of out there. Greater numbers than from gunshot wounds in 16 states, greater numbers than from car crashes. And it's kind of the 800-pound gorilla that nobody was actually recognizing. So I think the data improvement is very important.
Thank you on that. Mr. Wexler, with respect to Afghanistan and the drug trade there, whatever, has the President made any designations under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act of Afghan citizens?
There have been designations, yes. I'm going to have to defer to you to the State Department and the Treasury Department, who run the various designation processes about how many there are in the various names.
Wouldn't you think that you would know that, though? I mean, if you're seriously involved in that area, wouldn't that be one of the things that you'd want to be following up on so that you know?
We absolutely do. We coordinate on every single name to make sure that, and are encouraging this process to do these designations. Again, against any individual target that you're talking about, we want to go through a process to figure out, is the Treasury or the state authorities the right one to use? Should we use a law enforcement approach to go after this individual target? Or in some cases, do we want to use a military kinetic approach to go after that given target in Afghanistan, or a combination of them? And those are the efforts that are being made in the field on every node of the various networks that we have been mapping in each individual case. But there will be a different answer in each case about what the appropriate
which I guess is why I thought that you would have had the information as well, because if you're sort of coordinating this, and I would think every one of you knows who these people are that you're going after and take every opportunity to go after them.
Oh, yes. No.
Assuming there are a limited number of people here that we're talking about, well, and probably few institutions, because the banks aren't that prevalent here. You're talking more about hawalas and other informal processes, right?
The networks are not inextensive. That we're talking about, and there is no shortage of targets that we're going after. When it gets to institutions, then you're correct. Then there's a relatively small number. When you're talking about individuals and organizations, they're actually, unfortunately, we don't lack for targets.
Ambassador, the last time we went around, I got the feeling I sort of cut you off. There's something that you wanted to add to your last comment.
Only that the idea of going after the money is something we've been focused on for a very long time and have had extensive programs to address it. But it is also something where the adversary is extremely creative, and as we develop tools, they develop ways to work around them. So the comprehensive effort that Mr. Wexler described about how we're seeking to use new tools on the battlefield is something that we're working on every single day. But I may be the most aged person here, but when I was a bank examiner back in the 70s, we were working on this same problem with people buying expensive automobiles and then turning them in, in 15 minutes later to launder money. So it's an effort that goes on over time. And I think one of the key elements of the the work that we do, particularly in Latin America, is on money laundering and civil asset forfeiture, which is the way to take away the proceeds of crime.
Thank you. And again, I apologize if I did cut you off before. So I'm looking at this thing and I'm thinking, you know, about choke points. You know, we've got a lot of money spread out in a lot of different avenues, from interdiction to eradication to hitting the demand side, to going after the money, to going after the precursors, all of that. Is there any merit to the concept of picking one or two areas that we really think are the choke point in that, and consolidating all of our attention and resources on those avenues, and just really leaning hard to try to get some international consensus on that, as well as some interagency consensus, and just going full bore at that one or two areas that we think would have the most effect of shutting these people down? I think we already know it's not eradication, it's already not interdiction, but maybe look at some of the remaining ones and say, this is, we're just going to just double down and put all of our resources into this and set a period of years that we think we should see some effect from it, and just do it.
Attorney, I think if we knew what worked, that would probably be certainly the most helpful way. The sad fact is we don't actually know what works. I would tell you that I think the President's strategy, this very comprehensive strategy, is the best way to go. And I would cite the most recent example when President Obama and President Medvedev met last year, and we started a binational on narcotics. It was only to look at drug traffickers and drug trafficking. It became very clear both to the Federation of Russia and to the United States that that was a narrow way to look at the drug problem, particularly Russia's drug problem with 2.5 million heroin addicts. And it would have to be to look at prevention. It would have to be to look at what type of drug treatment systems are available to get these people back into the workforce. And it would have to be to go after the money, the financiers, the traffickers, et cetera. I think that balanced approach is probably the one that we have to put all our eggs spread across the spectrum, rather than into the two or three things that we might think work.
Yeah, interesting, because I think, again, I think we know it doesn't work, yet we keep doing it. It's, you know, the definition of insanity, I guess. And it's part of it. It's not just this president, it's all the presidents, it's all of us, you know, that have done this. We continue to think that we're just going to keep throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks here. And if we can't figure out what definitely works, if we can't get the data behind it to say this works, we're going to do it, we certainly can get the data behind what doesn't work and say, well, we've been trying this for a few decades now, and that certainly hasn't done it, because, you know, we get great enforcement agents and other people out there just beating their heads against the wall. They keep, and I know if you say to them, we're going to stop doing one thing or the other, they're going to get upset because every day they see results. But that's the point. Every day they see results, because there's an endless group of people that will be doing that forever. You can just keep repeating it over and over and over again instead of finding the angle that finally shuts down the operation. But I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tierney. We're going to move on to the third panel in a moment. I just want to thank each one of you for your service, for the work that you do. Mr. Tierney, as he often does, raised a question that requires some deeper level of analysis, and it seems that every time we hold these hearings, and this is the responsibility of this subcommittee, oversight over, you know, the Office of National Drug Control Policy. We're required to really ask some deeper questions about why, what drives this seemingly insatiable demand for drugs in our culture. And that's beyond the scope of this particular hearing, but it's sure something that we need to have a national discussion about, in terms of because for all that you do that works, that doesn't work, we can continue to go over this from now until kingdom come about what works, what doesn't work. We're missing the deeper question. What is it in our culture that drives this tremendous demand for these various types of drugs? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it's sure something that we need to get into, because otherwise all we're doing is shuffling policy this way, that way, and you still have this tremendous demand and a supply that's readily available, where people who are selling it are ready to risk life, limb, to make billions of dollars. So thank you for the service to the country, and we will move on to the third panel, which I'll introduce while the staff proceeds with the changing of the table there. Our third panel includes Adam Isaacson, Senior Associate for Regional Security at the Washington Office of Latin America. He joined the Washington Office of Latin America in 2010 after 14 years working on Latin American and Caribbean security issues with the Center for International Policy. Vonda Felbob Brown is a Foreign Policy Fellow at the Brookings Institution. She focuses on the national security implications of illicit economies and strategies for managing them. She is an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And Mark Kleiman. Is that Kleiman? Kleiman is Professor of Public Policy in the UCLA School of Public Affairs. Mr. Kleiman, Professor Kleiman, is a renowned expert on drug policy, teaches courses on methods of policy analysis, on drug abuse and crime control policy. As with those on the first and second panel, we ask that each witness give an oral summary of his or her testimony. Keep the summary 5 minutes in duration, and your complete written statement is going to be included in the hearing record. It is customary for all witnesses before our full committee and subcommittee to be sworn. I would ask that you raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses has answered in the affirmative. So you may proceed with your testimony. Mr. Isaacson, please begin.
Chairman Kucinich, Ranking Member Jordan, Mr. Tierney, I want to say a big thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing that I think is badly needed, and I congratulate you for holding it. I look forward to a good discussion. A big part of my work at the Washington Office on Latin America is monitoring U.S. aid to that part of the world. And where Latin America is concerned, U.S. aid really does mean counter-drug aid. In the 10 years between 2000 and 2009, 48% of our aid dollars spent in Latin America, $9.9 billion, went through counter-narcotics accounts in the state and defense departments' budgets. When you look only at the military and police aid that went to the whole region, 85% is counter-drug aid. So for all that, have we managed to reduce drug supplies? I'm afraid the answer is no. Look at cocaine, which is the only illegal drug produced entirely in Latin America, and by every measure, the tons produced, the price on U.S. streets, drug-related violence, these 10 years of aid did not reduce cocaine supplies. My written testimony provides the numbers comparing 2000 and 2009. So where do we go from here? In fact, the experience of the past 10 years in Colombia, Mexico, and elsewhere offers some compelling lessons. The first is that we have to do far more to reduce our own citizens' demand for illegal drugs. The new National Drug Control Strategy puts a greater priority on drug treatment, which is welcome, and let's hope it translates into greater resources in the next several years' budgets. Also, community corrections programs like Hawaii's HOPE probation program deserve more support. In Latin America, meanwhile, the lessons really are pointing in two directions, broad directions, strengthening states and reducing impunity. And while that sounds a bit like academic jargon, they deserve to be unpacked a bit. First, strengthening states. Counter-narcotics programs don't prosper in a vacuum of government. Whether that vacuum, it could be a wild jungle coca-growing region, or it could be a gang-ridden slum in a Latin American city, drug trafficking will thrive there if there's no state presence. And note, I say state presence, not military occupation. Of course, I mean, you can't set up big economic aid programs without security forces there to protect them, but military occupations also fail when the civilian part of the government doesn't show up. I mean the part that provides public goods beyond just security, property rights, equal protection under law, farm-to-market roads, health, education, clean water, a stable financial system. Second, impunity. Establishing a government presence, even a civilian government presence, isn't enough if it doesn't include a strong, credible judicial system alongside it. If a government is in a zone but it's acting abusively or corruptly toward its own people, and it does so without fear of punishment, then that population is not going to support its government. State presence can actually make matters worse without a judiciary in place to ensure nobody's above the law. Now, when the United States provides judicial aid, which we do, it has to include more for physical security for judges, prosecutors, investigators, and witnesses. It has to help increase manpower to reduce caseloads. And the investigators in these countries need technology, databases, data security, crime labs, DNA, forensics. This sort of strengthening states without impunity framework may be the best approach, but the thing is there's little specifically counter-narcotic about it. Put plainly, it's nation building. Programs like consolidation or integrated action in Colombia, which has been going on the last couple of years in Colombia, or helping Mexico reform its police and judiciary, they're costly and they require long-term commitments. By now, though, I think we've seen that there's really no other shortcuts. Is the United States government set up to help in this way? The agencies that provide the most aid to Latin America, who are represented on the last panel, INL at State, DASD Counternarcotics at Defense, they're counter-narcotics agencies. They're not governance and development agencies. And the White House office providing policy direction, ONDCP, they're limited to a narrower counter-drug mandate too. These agencies have important contributions to make, but I think the natural lead agency for civilian governance aid would be USAID. Where judicial reform is involved, it would be USAID and the Department of Justice. In the past, there has been aid for these priorities, but it's usually been channeled through the State Department's International Narcotics Control account. I think that's unnecessary, and it adds an extra layer that slows the delivery of aid. If we move in this direction, what will happen? If we expand the amount of territory that's governed and strengthen the rule of law in countries like Colombia and Mexico, those countries could become less hospitable to cocaine. But global demand for cocaine is likely to remain stable. The balloon effect tells us supply will move to other countries with weaker governance and greater impunity. Peru and Bolivia are seeing more cocaine right now. Central America is seeing more transshipment and cartel activity. We have to be vigilant about where the trade is migrating and start working proactively with those governments to strengthen their own capacities, especially their civilian and judicial capacities. Again, ONDCP and other counter-drug agencies will have an important role to play, but from now on it must be in support of a much larger governance and justice effort. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Feldbach-Brown, proceed.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Tierney, I am honored to have this opportunity to address you. As long as there is strong demand for illicit narcotics, supply-side measures should not be and cannot be expected to stop supply and prevent consumption. However, supply-side policies do have a great impact on the level of threat that the drug trade and drug trafficking organization and other non-state armed actors pose to state and societies in source and transshipment countries. They impact conflict intensity, institutional development, human rights, and basic state-society relations in source and transshipment countries. Often they do not do so in a positive way. Let me now highlight several general lessons about the effect of supply-side policies on these broader issues, and I'll be happy in the question period to talk specifically about Afghanistan, Mexico, or Colombia. The drug trade generates multiple threats to the United States and other states and societies. It often threatens public safety, at times even national security, in supply and transshipment countries. It can also compromise the political systems by increasing corruption and penetration by criminal entities and undermine legal economies. At the same time, large populations around the world in areas of minimal state presence, great poverty, and social and political marginalization are dependent on illicit economies, including the drug trade, for basic survival and the satisfaction of other socioeconomic needs. Supply-side measures, such as eradication and interdiction, have not yet succeeded in disrupting global supply of drugs in any lasting way. However, supply-side measures have at times been effective in suppressing production in particular locales. A good security is a key precondition for this success. Short of great political oppression that is deeply inconsistent with US values and interests, the second condition for success of supply-side policy in suppressing production in particular locales is a multifaceted state-building effort that seeks to strengthen the bonds between the state and marginalized communities dependent on vulnerable to participation in the drug trade. One component of such a program is the proper sequencing of alternative livelihood efforts and eradication, with eradication being implemented only when legal economic alternatives are in place. Effective alternative livelihoods requires further that it be designed as a well-funding, long-lasting, and comprehensive approach that does not merely center on searching for the replacement crop. it really amounts to either comprehensive rural development and, in places like Mexico or Brazil, a complex urban planning. The state-building approach also needs to include other components of state presence, such as the strengthening of law enforcement and justice and correction systems. But it needs to do so in a way that holds these other mechanisms and components of the state accountable to citizens. Interdiction does play a critical part in supply-side policies, including in ways to achieve these state-building objectives, but it should not be conceived primarily as a mechanism to stop supply, but rather as a mechanism to beef up law enforcement to prevent the ability of drug trafficking organizations to coerce or corrupt a state and societies. Stopping weapons flows and anti-money laundering measures are important components, but they should not be overstated in their effectiveness. They do not represent silver bullets, and indeed they are often some of the least effective approaches to be undertaken. Even when successful in particular locales, supply-side measures have inevitably transferred the transshipment or supply problems to new locales, whether these are new areas within a country or there are new countries altogether. The recognition of the balloon effect requires strategic prioritization of effort. The imperative to mitigate spillover effects to other countries, however, should not give impetus to simply rush to assist with counter-narcotics law enforcement efforts to new areas. Some of these areas, including in Central America and West Africa, have such weak state and law enforcement capacity and such high levels of corruption that their capacity to constructively absorb external assistance is limited. In devising supply-side policies, the United States needs to be aware of the limits to effectiveness of outside policy intervention and assistance. If we accept the proposition that supply-side policies are a critical component of state-building efforts and indeed should be construed as state-building efforts, we need to, however, realize that there is only so much an outside country can do to change the basic socioeconomic and political arrangements that persist in countries. And indeed, these socio-political arrangements, such as taxation system, will have great effect on the effectiveness of counter-narcotics policies. It is imperative that the US Congress demands of the executive detailed reporting on the design and effects of counter-narcotics policies abroad that focuses not simply on outputs, but indeed outcomes. Measures to reduce demand abroad must be a key component of US counter-narcotics policies. Many countries today have consumption levels on par or even greater than the United States. Many of these are located in Asia, in Latin America. Finally, it is important that consideration is given in the design of policies to second-degree effects and unintended consequences. A regular part of any policy analysis should be to consider where supply or smuggling routes will shift if counter-narcotics efforts are successful in particular locales. What kind of illegal enterprises or economies will criminal groups turn if their proceeds from the drug trade are diminished? Will they in fact seek to penetrate to a greater degree the legal economies? And whether these developments pose a greater threat to the United States and partner countries than the current conditions? Thank you.
Professor Kleiman.
Mr. Chairman, it's an honor to be invited to testify before this august body. Mr. Chairman, having required me to take an oath to tell the whole truth, I hope you will pardon me if I don't pull any punches. My theme today is the logic of counter-drug strategies in the context of insurgency and terrorism. My claim is that we have let the pieties of the drug war blind us to economic reality and commit us to unattainable goals. We make some drugs illegal because of the problem of drug abuse, and seems to be the best refutation to the claim that we would improve matters by legalizing them is to look at the one drug we legalized, alcohol, which causes more damage than all the illicit drugs combined. And by the way, somewhat modifies, Mr. Chairman, the claim that the U.S. has an unusual appetite for drugs. We have an unusual appetite for illicit drugs. In fact, if you add back alcohol, we're sort of in the middle of the league table. Anyway, we ban drugs because we're worried about drug abuse. Once the drugs are illegal, trafficking in them as a source of criminal revenue, the same capacities that allow an organization to function as a terrorist organization, secrecy, loyalty, weaponry, allow it also to function as a drug dealing organization. And when a terrorist or insurgent group controls a piece of territory, it can collect money from drug dealers who operate in that territory, either as tax or in return for actual services in protecting drug dealers from one another and from law enforcement. And indeed, drugs provided some of the funding for the Contras, for the FARC, for the Colombian Paras, for the Northern Alliance warlords, and for the Taliban. Preventing terrorists and insurgents from successfully engaging in or taxing drug dealing is one way to reduce their power. And fighting drug-related corruption is one way to improve governance. So much is true. But the following, Mr. Chairman, is not true. That doing drug law enforcement generally in areas where terrorists operate is the same as fighting terrorism. That counter-narcotics is counterinsurgency. Not only is that not true, it is precisely backwards. Drug enforcement raises prices. Volume doesn't go down nearly as much as price goes up, especially for exported drugs. Therefore, drug enforcement tends to make drug dealers in general richer, which indirectly benefits those who can extract taxes from them. Worse, insofar as terrorists function as drug dealers, they're among the harder sorts of drug dealers to catch because they have violence and influence at their command. So it's mostly their competitors we're going to put out of business unless we target very carefully. So drug enforcement without respect to persons, as one of the earlier witnesses mentioned, is exactly the wrong thing to do. Moreover, the value of protection services goes up as the intensity of enforcement goes up. The bigger a threat law enforcement is to drug dealing, the more it's worthwhile paying an insurgent or a warlord for protection. So, untargeted drug law enforcement provides material support for terrorism. It's not anybody's intention, but that's the result. It's true in Afghanistan. I think it's true in Mexico. The goal, which has been discussed today extensively, the goal of stopping the flow is unattainable. Drug consumption in the United States is determined overwhelmingly by conditions in the United States, not abroad. We can redirect the flow. We can try to control the collateral damage. But the effort to solve our drug problem in someone else's country is worse than futile. Mr. Chairman, the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is punished for some outrageous misdeed in the afterlife by being forced to continually roll a stone up a hill, and as soon as he gets to the top of the hill, it rolls back down. The myth is familiar. I don't believe the GAO report on that myth is familiar, but it's entitled, "Stone Rolling Goals Not Being Achieved, Sisyphus Needs to Assert Better Performance Measures." And then it goes on to say that he needs to push the stone up the hill more often and have a goal of doubling the amount of time it stays at the top of the hill before it rolls back down within the next 3 years. When you're pursuing an exercise in futility, it doesn't do any good to measure it more precisely. 90% of the cost of drugs in the U.S. to U.S. users is U.S. markups. We cannot fix this problem overseas. And yes, we can reduce drug production in some parts of Afghanistan, and it'll go up in other parts of Afghanistan. It was mentioned that a number of about 27 of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan are now poppy-free. That's regarded as an accomplishment. The other 7 are the ones controlled by the Taliban. So our accomplishment is to have made our enemies a monopolist in the world opium trade. I suggest that's not something we want to simply measure more accurately. It needs to be rethought. And we need to change the rhetoric of international drug control. A report yesterday in the Chinese news service Xinhua quotes a UN official as dismissing the arguments that show how drug enforcement can enrich terrorists. It must be right, he says, to crack down on anyone who is deeply involved in the drug trade, right? That's your drug enforcement without respect to persons. It must be right. Mr. Chairman, I submit that is the language of incantation, not of analysis. It must be right because we've been saying it for years, but that doesn't keep it from being wrong. So, I claim that we need to rethink our policies in Afghanistan, targeted enforcement, targeted at insurgents, anti-corruption efforts. In Mexico, I think we need to think about picking one of the big drug trafficking organizations and taking it down by making it uncompetitive. I'll be happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Kleiman. Mr. Isaacson, in looking at your testimony, you talk about the extraordinary amount of money that goes for, or that has gone over the past for military aid related to counter-narcotics. Our military budget carries within it headlong momentum that keeps funding hardware far into the future, notwithstanding exigent circumstances or long-term predicted circumstances for their use. Since such a substantial amount of money goes to fund the hardware side of this, is it possible that one of the driving forces for funding these, quote, counter-narcotics efforts is a continued support for this military-industrial complex?
I don't know who coined the term drug war industrial complex, but there certainly is such a thing. I mean, there are...
Such a thing as what?
As a drug war industrial complex, where you've got companies, whether they're making helicopters or other hardware, or whether they're contractors who are actually carrying out programs like aerial herbicide fumigation, who have a very strong interest and actually do lobby actively in favor of increased counter-drug spending.
Do you want to comment, Professor Svelbit-Brown? Do you have anything to say? Let me ask you another question here. Dr. Felbert-Brown, what do you think about Professor Kleiman's conclusion that alternative livelihood programs in Afghanistan contribute directly to funding the insurgency? Is this, am I quoting this correctly, through taxes levied by the insurgents on the alternative livelihood programs?
Right, so there are two aspects of it. And this argument,
did I characterize that question, did I characterize your conclusion correctly?
One half of it is that there may be taxation of the effort. The other thing is, if you succeed in getting some farmers to not grow poppy, particularly in government-controlled areas, you're increasing the demand for poppy in non-government-controlled areas.
Ms. Felbert-Brown.
Well, I agree with the proposition that the Taliban taxes a lot of different economies, both legal and illegal, including aid projects and US-funded aid projects. That's a consequence of the fact that the government and the ISAF does not have good territorial control and be able to prevent Taliban penetration. I would, however, argue that should not be the position then to cancel these programs, because I do not believe that insurgencies can be defeated through the efforts to bankrupt them. There is no evidence that any insurgency has as yet been defeated through efforts to bankrupt them, whether these efforts were interdiction of counter-narcotics of narcotics generated money or eradication programs.
Well, indeed, you pointed out in your testimony that it is, quote, highly unlikely that interdiction measures can significantly reduce the Taliban's income and greatly limit its operational capacity, unquote.
Indeed. However, I do believe that it is critical for winning insurgencies, for winning counterinsurgencies, for defeating insurgency, to win the hearts and minds of the population. Offering better governance, greater security, and better economic options is a critical component of that.
But in doing that, you can talk about better government. There is an assumption that when we say better government, we mean not the Taliban, we mean central government, but the corruption in the central government, which by now is legendary, has linked government with traffickers. And you're saying that there's a need to target, quote, target government-linked traffickers to send a message that the era of impunity is over.
Indeed, you are right, sir. Perhaps the Achilles heel of our project in Afghanistan is the poor quality of governance that includes corruption linked to drugs, includes many other forms of malfeasance and corruption. I agree with Professor Kleiman's testimony that the more we simply blanketly use law enforcement, the more likely it is that the most violent armed actors will end up being the ones holding the largest proportion of the traffic. So I think there is some great wisdom in focusing on Taliban-linked traffickers. However, the other component of insurgency, of counterinsurgency, is of course to show that the population, that the government is more just, can provide better governance. And because the corruption is so notorious and so detrimental, it is important that at least some of the highest linked traffickers linked to the highest members of the government are prosecuted and done so effectively.
I'm going to direct staff. I think that your testimony with respect to Afghanistan is quite compelling. Particularly in terms of the right, how our programs can raise expectations among the population and then withdraw the money suddenly, and the expectations plummet, support for insurgencies continue. I'm going to recommend your testimony to be read by the Secretary of Defense and by General Petraeus, because I think we really need to have a strong response from them about the observations that you've made before this subcommittee in your testimony. I'm going to move on to Mr. Tierney, and then we'll have another round of questions for the panel. Mr. Tierney.
Thank you, and hello to all of you, and thank you for your testimony, written and oral, on that. Ms. Falbo-Brown, the program, the so-called Avipa Plus program that they're running out of Afghanistan down in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, where they give cash for work, small grants, basically to procure different equipment or whatever, vouchers for high-tech sort of things on the farming, whatever, and training with respect to all of that. Have you had any knowledge about whether or not there's been any success with that or how that's going?
Well, Mr. Tierney, it is very difficult to judge success because the programs have been in place for relatively little period, and often the reporting that we hear from members of the executive are reporting on outputs, not necessarily outcomes. So I think there is a great need for careful monitoring. That said, I do have some concern along the lines that Mr. Kucinich raised. I am concerned that some of these programs are being designed as buy-offs of the population rather than effective, sustainable long-term development. And I understand the excruciating dilemma that the administration is facing, ISAF is facing, in needing to win hearts and minds, including because the lives of our men and women are at stake and because the timeline is running out. But there is a real danger that the buy-offs will not be effective, that they will not sufficiently buy the population, and at the same time, when they are no longer sustainable because funding ends, they will then be directly counterproductive. They will, in fact, alienate the population. And we have seen that with many programs where emphasis have been put on the physical structure. development sort of isn't if you cannot kick the building, the school, as opposed to, for example, providing teachers or doctors. And people have been deeply, deeply disappointed and antagonized. And at the same time, we have not seen that programs such as Offering Village or diesel generator are sufficient to generate intelligence flows to make a big difference on the battlefield. So while I absolutely understand the imperative to demonstrate to the population that the better future lies with the government supported by ASAF, I would be very concerned not to design the programs as short-term buy-offs.
A question for all of you is, do you think we're approaching this in the wrong way if we're seeing all of these as sort of counter-narcotics programs as opposed to just focusing on the development aspect of that and say, look, that there's many different outcomes you could have from a good development program, to say that it's just part of counter-narcotics and focusing money from the counter-narcotics program over there as opposed to broadening out the concept moving forward? Would that be a better approach, Mr. Isaacson?
I do agree that it is the wrong approach, because if you're calling it a counter-narcotics program, it completely changes how you measure success. You're not measuring how many people feel like they're governed. You're not measuring how many people have government representatives in their town saying, you can't grow this anymore, but you have alternatives. You're measuring how many acres of crops were destroyed, or you're measuring some estimate of how many tons were produced. And that doesn't really capture the picture, and it captures something that can perhaps show short-term gains and fluctuations, but not the overall trend.
Mr. Conlon?
Mr. Tierney, I completely agree. Insofar as we're measuring reductions in drug production, we're measuring exactly the wrong thing. We want to measure whether we're making farmers richer and more trustful of the government. Afghanistan currently has about 90% of the world's opium production. There's no country in the old world that's nearly competitive with Afghanistan in terms of producing opium. Now, I'm not saying that 10 years from now there won't be another producer, because producers do change. In the near term, Afghanistan is going to produce all the opium that the old world wants. And that's then a function of supply and consumption conditions in Iran, in Russia, in Europe, in Pakistan. To try to reduce drug production in Afghanistan is completely misguided. A very small portion of the price that a drug user pays for heroin is accounted for by the value of poppy at the farm gate, or even of heroin at the refinery gate in Afghanistan. So a lot of enforcement effort can push that price up a little bit, not going to change consumption very much, not going to make some other country. If you really wanted to reduce drug consumption in Afghanistan, pray for a failed state in Burma. Right? If Burma completely collapsed, it might compete with Afghanistan in poppy production. But we're not going to reduce poppy production in Afghanistan by chopping down crops, or by paying people not to grow crops, or by arresting heroin processors or dealers. It just doesn't work that way. 4% of the arable land in Afghanistan is planted in poppy. Land is not scarce. And we've well demonstrated that we can move poppy production around Afghanistan, but not change the volume. I don't think changing the volume is a realistic goal. I don't think protecting, in Afghanistan, of course, it's ridiculous because we get very little heroin from Afghanistan. But for the whole world, the notion that the goal of our foreign drug programs is to protect drug consumers in the U.S., completely misguided. We want to protect drug consumers in the U.S. We have to do stuff about drug demand in the U.S. That does not mean offering treatment to addicts and lying to school children. It means finding the heavy drug users who are mostly in the criminal justice system, getting them to stop. Professor Hawken will be talking about that tomorrow, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tierney. We're going to have one brief round of questions of the witnesses. I'm looking at your testimony, Mr. Isaacson, and it's a very, very well researched. Much appreciated. I want to ask you, in your research, have you ever seen any indication that there is a narcotics strategy being used by intelligence interests to try to destabilize governments. Is that possible? For example, we've received information that, I mean, it's probably public knowledge, but that there's been a proliferation of drugs from certain areas in Asia into Russia. Now, is there ever any? Have you ever heard of any, aside from the obvious incentives of selling drugs?
The actual fostering of narcotics in order to undermine an enemy country, something like that.
Has that ever happened?
I cannot think of any real examples in Latin
Is that just
America.
the stuff of science fiction, or?
No, I would have to look at maybe the work of Professor Al McCoy, who did some work on this in Southeast Asia, but I'm not very familiar with it.
Does anyone have anything to offer about that? I'm just...
Well, during the 1980s Soviet war in Afghanistan, Soviet military faced very large addiction rates, and the Soviet military leadership often believed that this was not accidental, that
that what was not accidental?
that the addiction rates among the Soviet military were not accidental, and they believed that the U.S. Perhaps encouraged the addiction rates. Of course, the reality is that the conditions of the Russian troops, the Soviet troops in Afghanistan, were often so difficult that it motivated many soldiers without outside help to resort to narcotics.
Amen to that. There's a long-term flip of this, right? I mean, you can get uncounted numbers of pamphlets explaining how the communists are flooding the United States with drugs, right? So it was the North Koreans, or it was the Cubans, or it was the Russians. There's a persistent fantasy that the cause of drug trafficking is drug traffickers. The cause of drug trafficking is consumption.
Right.
And no, it doesn't need any help from the United States or anybody else for Russia, given its current economic and social and political conditions, to have a terrific drug problem.
I would just, final question to each member of the panel. Spending on interdiction and international counter-narcotics programs has increased by almost 100% since 2002. If you were asked which programs should be cut to get us back to the spending levels of, let's say, the pre-Bush administration, what would be your recommendation?
Let's see. If you were to divide the hard side strategies into interdiction, eradication, and sort of going after the kingpins, I'd say eradication should take the deepest cut by far, because it really has not, it's almost been counterproductive in some places.
I agree with that statement, and I would suggest, however, that interdiction should be reoriented from the futile effort of thinking that borders can be closed, whether U.S. borders or borders in Afghanistan or borders along Colombia, and instead focus on building effective law enforcement that tackles crime, street crime, not just organized crime, and that is accountable to the citizens of the country.
Professor.
It was mentioned earlier in the hearing that the task force in the Caribbean substantially disrupted the drug trade from Colombia into South Florida, and that's true. What was not mentioned, but is explained quite clearly in Rob Bonner's foreign policy article, is that the result was the development of the throughput trade through Central America and Mexico. The current Mexican crisis is the consequence of our successful interdiction effort in the Caribbean. It seems to me, if we had to choose between destabilizing the Bahamas and destabilizing Mexico, I think that's an easy choice. So the first thing I would cut would be the Caribbean effort. Now, I say that not having to get any votes in Florida, but we're currently doing something really disastrous to Mexico by making it hard to get drugs in the other way. If we stop imagining that we're going to solve our drug problem, start to say, look, the flow into the U.S. depends on demand in the U.S., and the sales organizations in the U.S., and we can do something about them. And then all we can do is decide how the drugs come in and how much damage they do. That seems to me ought to be the new focus. And as long as we tell the interdiction people that their job is keeping drugs out of the country, we are condemning them to futility, as Jack Lawn said when he was DEA administrator. And a member of Congress asked him why we couldn't just keep the drugs out of the country. He said, Congressman, if we built a 50-foot wall around the United States, the traffickers would buy 51-foot ladders.
Because they're supplying a demand.
Because they're supplying and demand, we can sometimes reduce the street availability of drugs in a way that reduces consumption. That's turned out to be very hard. We have 15 times as many cocaine dealers in prison in the United States today as we had in 1980. Price of cocaine is down by 90%. What we can do more effectively, since most of the drugs go to heavy users, most of the heavy users are criminally active and get arrested. So they're going to be on pretrial release, on probation, or on parole when they're not in prison or jail. The HOPE project has demonstrated that you can enormously reduce their drug consumption. And since they're where the drug consumers are, that's our hope for reducing the damage we're doing to Mexico through our demand for illicit drugs.
This subcommittee is going to continue its oversight of the Office of National Drug Control Policy and of the more broad question of supply and demand with respect to the United States. And so because of that, you as witnesses, because you've been so helpful to the work of this subcommittee, you may find yourself being invited again to testify. Each of you has developed a very incisive expertise that has helped to inform the work of this subcommittee, and we're very grateful for that. I just want to express that to you individually and collectively.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This is the Domestic Policy Subcommittee of Oversight and Government Reform. The topic of today's hearing has been international counter-narcotics policies. Do they reduce domestic consumption or advance other foreign policy goals? We have been gifted with 3 panels of witnesses, all of whom have helped us to explore this question, and which we will continue. I want to thank the staff of our majority as well as the minority for their participation, as well as for Mr. Tierney and Mr. Jordan's participation. This committee stands adjourned.